Hey guys, Erin here with Southern Girl Exotics. Welcome back to my channel. So I've been wanting to do this video for a little while. I had it in the works last year before I took my little 2-month hiatus to deal with all the holiday stuff. But I think it's a pretty important video. This is totally going to be directed towards beginners. If you've been into gargoyle geckos for a while, this video is probably not going to be relevant. If it is, great. If you learned something. If not, you'll see some pretty gargs, and that's about it. But it is a regularly asked question among new garg keepers, and that is, what morph is my gargoyle gecko? What do I label it as? How do I call or identify its traits? And this is a great question, especially if you want to be like the rest of us and show off your beautiful animal on social media. You want to be able to identify it correctly. You want to sound like you know what you're talking about. There is a wonderful website that Gargoyle Gecko Queen, or Gargoyle Queen Reptiles, I think is what she is now. Anyways, she, on her website, she has done an amazing job writing out really descriptive identifying traits of gargoyle geckos, how we identify them, what they look like. She's added pictures. It's really, really a great reference if you're wanting to know what your gargoyle gecko morph is, or kind of how the traits work. She doesn't really go into that, and I've already done a video that kind of dives into that, so I'm not going to do that here. We're not going to talk about what's more dominant, what traits will give you what, because like I said, I've already done a video that did kind of like a crash course in that, so we're not going to do all that. This video is just going to be based on explaining what traits are out there when it comes to gargoyle geckos and how we identify them. So I got my favorite girl, Pearl, out to do the intro. This was my first gargoyle gecko I ever got. She is an orange blotch reticulated gargoyle gecko. When I got her 7 years ago, 6-7 years ago, maybe even longer now, orange blotches were the thing. Like, she was expensive for what gargoyles were back then. But orange blotches were the thing, and you can see she does not have a ton of color, but nonetheless, as far as gargoyle gecko market was, I paid a good bit for her. Nonetheless, she is my favorite gargoyle gecko. She is just priceless. I bred her one time many years ago, and now she is just a big fat loaf that lives her best life here. She's great for handling. She's just been an amazing pet. I will never sell her. I will never get rid of her. She has opened up my world to gargoyle geckos, and I am so grateful to her for it. Anyways, that's what I want to do in this video. I want it to be for beginners that have that question. What do I label my gargoyle gecko as? What traits does it have? So hopefully this will be informational for those of you that don't know the answer to those questions. And again, those of you that know all of this, it's not going to be anything that's taught you anything. Maybe you'll just get to see some beautiful gargoyle geckos. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy the video. Definitely give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and I will see you at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. Alright, so I busted out my two big girls for this beginning part. Garg morphs are pretty straightforward. There are two main morphs that we recognize. These are going to relate to pattern morphs. So we've got striped. She's playing dead, I promise you. She's a perfectly healthy, happy animal, but I just pulled her out of her cork bar. Anyways, we identify two main morphs among gargoyle geckos. You have reticulated and banded, which go under the same category, and then you have striped. So gargoyle gecko morphs and traits that we identify are pretty straightforward. It's not like ball pythons where you have these funky little names like spinner blast that means it's 4 genes put together, or you know, I don't work with pythons, but you get the point. We don't have a bunch of funky names that mean something else. So we do have striped, which is self-explanatory, and we have reticulated and banded, which goes together. They are different, but they fall under the same category. Now, when we're talking about morphs, we're talking about their pattern traits. So this has nothing to do with color. So you can see she has orange striping, she has orange blotching. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. We are strictly talking about the pattern underneath that color. Now, we do also identify color traits. We also identify base color. And then there's also some little fun things that we've kind of picked up along the way, like eyebrows and lipstick and blushing. I'm not going into all of that. That's pretty self-explanatory. However, we are going to focus on the two main morphs as well as color traits and base colors so that you fully understand how to identify and label your Gargoyle Gecko. All right, so let's start with the banded and reticulated morph. So like I mentioned in the intro, Pearl is considered a reticulated Gargoyle Gecko. And typically what that means is if we're looking at her base color underneath the orange blotches, you can see that it is a bunch of speckled colors. She's got blacks, yellows, whites, creams. It's almost like every scale just about is a little bit of a different color, and that makes up that very pixeled almost look that reticulated animals have. There's not really a uniformity to it. It is just kind of a bunch of tiny little speckles of color everywhere. Then we have banded. Now, as you can see, banded is going to give you these bands. Again, we're not looking at the orange, we are just looking at the black. It's going to give you these bands that runs across the back and body. Now again, these aren't necessarily uniform. They're not all going to look the same. They're not going to be straight lines across. They're not going to be in the same place on every animal. They're going to be a little different on every animal, but you should be able to see those jagged lines running across when you have a banded animal. With those bands, you can see why this is considered a form of reticulation, because if you look at her other part of her base color, you can see the tiny scales all having some different colors. She's got blacks and more browns in her reticulation than Pearl did. Now, I'm not going to go into this much. This is considered more of a mottled MOTT-LED. Nobody really identifies or uses the term that much, but it is a lot less uniform with the banding and almost a really even split between reticulated pattern and banding. But you can see the banding slightly as well as the reticulation in this animal. Nonetheless, I would consider this one banded if I was to label it. Or you can play it safe like a lot of people do and just call them all reticulated. It's not going to make a difference. People are going to know what you're meaning to identify when you use the label reticulated. If you haven't noticed as well, all of these animals slightly differ in color when it comes to their scales, their reticulated scales and their bands. So just because it's reticulated doesn't mean that the scales are all a certain color or they're going to look the same. When we refer to the pattern as reticulated, we are strictly just talking about how it is displayed in that speckled look. And then we have stripes. Stripes are pretty self-explanatory. Again, we're going to be looking at the pattern only, and you're going to be noticing the black and brown that run from the head to the vent on this animal. That is the identifying factor you're looking for. Now, there are some variations of striped. Mosaics are typically striped animals. You'll see the black or brown striping on the back, and then it almost looks like some random broken bands on the side. You'll see, I don't know that I have any offhand in my collection. I'll have to find a picture to show y'all. Mosaics are, from some people's point of view, they're considered to be wild type. Other people refer to reticulateds as wild type. Nonetheless, mosaics are pretty rare. There are some people working with them, and they have been proven to be passed on, a trait that can be passed on to the children and continued on, but not a lot of people at this moment are working with mosaics. Now, there is such a thing as a super stripe. Unfortunately, because so many people can't agree to agree on certain definitions, super stripes can mean two different things depending who you talk to. A lot of old school breeders like to refer to super stripes. Matter of fact, she's considered a super stripe in that aspect. But a lot of older breeders like to refer to super stripes as animals that have striping that start on the nose. You see how she's got the brown striping right here, and it runs all the way down. It doesn't necessarily have to do with how many stripes, but it typically is an animal that has the striping that starts at the head instead of just at the nape of the neck to the vent. Now, because the hobby loves labels, and especially labels that warrant higher price tags, a lot of times there are words that we use to identify saturation in gargoyle geckos that not everybody universally uses. So again, when we're talking about super stripe, a lot of older breeders refer to it the way I just showed you with that animal. Other breeders, especially new age breeders, like to use it a lot to identify color striping. So not pattern trait, but the color of an animal. It can be a 6-stripe, it can be an animal whose back is completely filled. You don't see any separation in the dorsal striping, color striping. So it just depends who you ask, and you always need to be aware of that, because you may assume you're buying an animal that is being labeled as a super stripe, and you are thinking that that means that it's going to have a ton of color in certain areas, or that it's going to be a 6-stripe, and come to find out it may be a breeder that is referring to the striping in the pattern from the neck or from the nose down. All right, guys, now that we have discussed pattern traits, banded reticulated, and striped, we're going to move on to their color traits. Color traits are what make gargoyle geckos so interesting, as well as so much fun to breed. They are such amazing animals when it comes to displaying the different colors. Now, color traits are going to refer strictly to the color you see on the animal. It has nothing to do with the pattern or the base. It has everything to do with the color that you see on top. So striped animals are going to have striped color, and reticulated and banded animals are going to have blotching. Blotching is going to be that really super cool and unique random placement of little splotches of color. What's really cool about blotching is there's just no one that is the same as the other. It is so random where it's placed. Every animal, it's almost like fingerprints. Every animal is going to display it a little differently, and the saturation possibilities with blotches, it's just insane. But there's different variations to both blotching and to striped color traits. So we'll start with the striped color trait. Stripes are going to have 2 stripes or 4 stripes or 6 stripes. Typically when identifying a gargoyle gecko, you're not going to hear a lot of people identify it as a 4 stripe or a 2 stripe. Typically 6 stripe is the only time you really hear people throw that in when they are labeling their gargoyle gecko, because it is more unique and rare, and most of the time 6 stripes, they're more common now, but most of the time 6 stripes are going to be higher end. They're also going to be what people typically hold on to into their collections. Nonetheless, there are beautiful 4 stripes. There's even beautiful 2 stripes. I'm going to give you guys a couple little of examples of what I've got in my collection. She's kind of in the middle of a 4 stripe or a 6 stripe. Her stripes, her 2 on the back, well, her 4 on the back, you can see the 2 on each side are starting to blend. She may turn out to be a 4 stripe, but currently she is a 6 stripe. When you count the stripes, you count the laterals, 1, 2, and then you count the stripes on the back. Typically there are 4 stripes on the back. Again, pretty self-explanatory how to count your stripes. But this girl right here, I refer to her as a 6 stripe. This boy right here, excuse me, is a great example of what I would consider a 2 stripe. He's got such minimal little bits of color on the side. I don't even really count that, but you can see his 4 dorsal stripes technically are 2. They are pretty bled together and close together, so I would consider him a 2-striped animal. This boy is much easier to identify as a 6 stripe. He's got the full striping in the laterals, and then you can see the clear separation between the striping on his back. Here is an example of some of my favorite striping. This is when you have a clear stripe trait going on, but you start getting the blotching or the broken aberrant look on the sides and the outer stripe. These are some of my favorite animals because, one, you typically get some really funky, cool color placement. That color always tends to spread from when they were babies too, so it's always pretty wow once they become adults. But nonetheless, it just gives you a ton of variation with the stripe trait. All right, next let's move on to blotching and the different variations of blotching. We have super blotches, we have regular blotches. There's all different degrees, but we only have 2 main terms that we refer to in blotches. Typically you have a blotch or you have a super blotch. It's such a subjective term because there's no bottom line of how much the animal needs to be covered with blotching to be considered a super blotch. Somebody once told me that if you have to question if you have a super blotch, you probably don't have a super blotch. I actually require quite a bit of blotching before I will use the term. I know many people don't use it at all. Again, older breeders won't use it at all. Because like I said, it's very subjective, it can be misleading, and it's more of a term that is used to warrant higher price tags, more clout chasing, than to actually describe a specific amount of coverage on an animal. Blotches like stripes can come in every color. You can have red, you can have orange, variations of those colors. You can have tangerine orange, reddish orange. There are tons of variations to the colors, but in my opinion, blotching is probably the most unique, varied color trait of the 2. All right, besides the term super blotch, we have a term that technically isn't universally agreed upon. Some people use it, some people don't, to identify this placement of color, but that is the skeleton. I use it. I think it's important when we have a trait that is regularly reoccurring to easily identify what it is we're talking about. Skeletons, like all blotches, can come in all different colors. This female right here is about to shed, but she is a purplish color when she's fired up and doesn't have her pajamas about to come off. And then we have this red girl right here who is actually her sister. Nonetheless, both of them are what you would consider a skeleton. Skeletons are a lot easier to identify when they're younger. When they are babies, you can clearly see the traits. And what it is, what a skeleton is you're going to have this blotching of color that goes all the way down the back in almost a straight line. The reason it gets a little finicky when you get older, or when they get older, is that the color will start to spread like you see on her. See how it's coming off to the sides? So it's not quite as uniform as it looked when she hatched. Nonetheless, we are slowly but surely learning that this is a trait that we can recreate. Now, base color. So this is going to be what color the animal is at its base. Now, when we are going to identify what the base color is, we are always going to identify it as a fired up animal. Just like you would with crested geckos, or really any animal that fires up and down, that is going to be your deciding factor of what the base color is. A lot of gargoyle geckos tend to fire down white. So when you are going to identify the base color of your animal, you are going to have to do that when it is fired up and you get a good look at it. This right here is considered a white base animal. He doesn't get much darker than this when he fires up. White base animals are really cool because they tend to really show the color. The color truly pops on white based animals. So this is a fired up reticulated animal, as you can see. And this boy I would consider a brown base, even though, or a dark base. That's kind of like a safety that people will rely on when they're not sure. He's definitely not as black as what I would want him to be to comfortably call him a black base, but he has a ton of black in his base color, but I would refer to him as a brown-based reticulated red blotch. Unfortunately, she is fired down here, but this girl is a wonderful example of a red base. She has the purple undertone. Again, you're not going to see it here due to the LED lights. And they tend to fire down a really light purplish color. Very beautiful animals. Unfortunately, it is the middle of the day and it is chilly, with it being 16 degrees outside. So all of my animals are fired down and resting. Nonetheless, I'll show you a picture. This is about the closest I have to what I think is a genuinely orange-based animal when he's fired up. His orange base is just incredible. There's no denying that it's orange. You just can't mistake it for a brown base. All right, so now that we understand how base colors work, how do we use that as an identifying factor? Again, red bases are really the only time, or a genuine orange base, that you will hear people use it when they are identifying their animal. Red-based, red-striped animal. Red-based, red-blotched animal. Same with stripes. Orange-based, orange-striped animal. Orange-based, orange reticulated or banded, whichever one you know your animal is. If you want to differentiate, you can between the two. Gargoyle gecko. So base colors, again, sometimes people will highlight white bases, especially if it's a genuine light white base, where when it fires up, it really keeps a good crisp white, and it's not like just that muddy, I don't know, it's more of like an off-white yellowy color. But typically reds and orange bases are the only time you're really going to see people identifying. It doesn't really matter. The main thing, if you are going to list your animal for sale or you just want to identify it correctly, then the best way to do that is to stick with the pattern trait and the color trait. But I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, like I said, because I know it is super important to a lot of people to be able to identify what they have in their collection, as well as know what they're about to buy. You want to be able to understand what it is you're reading in these labels. And what may be easy for me to understand is not always easy for a beginner or somebody new to a certain species. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. You know the deal. Definitely give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And I hope you guys have an amazing week, and I will see you next week. Thanks for watching.